Hi, I'm Jess, part-time Hobbit, and I'm here to talk to you about Tolkien. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you're here, I'm gonna assume you like the Lord of the Rings movies. I'll admit it, I too have been known to dabble. There are 1,000 things I could say that I like about the trilogy, but one of the things that consistently catches my eye is the production design and the designer's absolute attention to detail. Tolkien dedicated much of his time to making sure that Middle-earth was as immersive and fleshed out as possible. And the commitment of the production design team to fulfilling that part of his vision truly sets the trilogy apart from other fantasy adaptations. One of the areas where this attention to detail is most apparent is in the costume design. To be honest, if I tried to cover every costume in the trilogy in a single video, we would probably be sitting here until the new Rings of Power show came out. So I'm gonna split this up into a couple of different videos. That way we can really get a good look at all the details that allowed the designers to take Tolkien's word off the page and stitch them into reality. This video is going to cover the Hobbit costumes from the Lord of the Rings trilogy, as well as from the Hobbit trilogy. I know, please hold off your angry Hobbit trilogy thoughts for now. I'm gonna get to that in a couple of weeks in a lot more depth, so just hang on for a minute. Despite the Hobbit's very frequently addressed shortcomings, the film still gives us an interesting insight into the wardrobe of Middle-earth, which is worth talking about. I aspire to someday be just half as brave as the Lord of the Rings costume team. The production required over 40 seamstresses working for literal years before and during the production process, and their work was certainly cut out for them. Due to the practical effects used in the filming of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, over 40 versions of each main character's costume had to be constructed in order to accommodate scale doubles, stunt doubles, body doubles, pretty much any double you can think of. These costumes had to not only just be constructed, but cleaned and maintained throughout a very rigorous filming process. Great care was taken to preserve the continuity and levels of wear across these costumes. You couldn't exactly have Frodo's stunt double wearing his swanky brand new outfit from Fellowship as he's crawling up Mount Doom on his hands and knees. The designers had to tiptoe a very delicate line of making sure that the costumes were simple enough to mass produce, but still complex enough to communicate Tolkien's world on screen. The Hobbit's clothing is an excellent example of how simplicity doesn't necessarily equal dullness. Through careful use of layers, texture, and weathering, the designers made sure that every fiber told a story. Before I dive further into the specific costumes of characters, let's look at Hobbit kind in general, what the books tell us and what the designers tell us. In the Hobbit's first chapter, they're described as half the height of a normal person, beardless, and rotund. They dress in bright colors, particularly green and yellow. This is more or less all of the guidance that Tolkien gave, so the designers were left with a massive sandbox to play in. Sir Richard Taylor, the chief creative supervisor of the trilogy, had been working on developing the visual look of Middle-earth for years before production. Neela Dixon stepped in as the costume designer later in the process. She had the very tricky task of taking Taylor's concepts and the visions of decades of Tolkien illustrators and refining them into actual wearable pieces. She sought a style that was quite British, and that seems appropriate considering the role of hobbits in the story. Hobbits were, without a doubt, inspired by the British people that Tolkien lived amongst. They're down to earth and more rooted in reality than any other race in Middle-earth. In many ways, hobbits act as a stepping stone, a familiar piece of ground that can lead readers further into the magic of Arda. By having the protagonists be these sort of everyman, the readers are able to view Middle-earth through the eyes of someone who is nearly as naive as them. It makes sense then to save the more high-concept design choices for the likes of elven kings and queens. The Hobbit costumes are loosely placed within the 18th century, comfortably before the modern era, but not so far in the past that they're made to feel foreign. In this way, they are immersive without coming across as too contemporary. It would be a mistake, of course, to say that hobbits are simply half-sized Englishmen, since they do have a fair bit of magic themselves. In order to avoid this misconception, Dixon introduced the now iconic Hobbit trousers. She explains that they served partly a practical function, in order to ensure that audiences wouldn't forget about the Hobbit's giant hairy feet. However, it's Also an effective tool to separate hobbits from real historical dress, shifting their look just into the realm of whimsy. Dixon refers to them as wacky half-mast pants, but I think it's just because she was too afraid to call them capris. I'm not, though. I'm brave enough to admit that if hobbits lived in the modern era, they would probably be wearing cargo shorts. I don't like it, but I will not deny the truth. Now that we've explored the context of Hobbit costumes at large, or small, I suppose, let's dive into some specifics, starting out with our main Hobbit gang. Early on, Merry and Pippin's costumes are all about setting them apart from each other. From their first moment on screen, they're dressed in meticulously different styles, something that's very important for two characters that spend the first film and a half glued at the hip. It's a valiant effort, although I will admit that I couldn't tell them apart until I was 17 years old, which may have been a personal problem. Upon introduction at Bilbo's 11th birthday party, Pippin's sleeves are rolled up and his vest is undone, in stark contrast to Merry's rather buttoned-up look. Merry is in red and yellow, good Hobbit colors, and he isn't as layered up as some of the older characters. Compared to Pippin, he's put together, but he's still youthful and carefree. This look carries over into their first scene in The Green Dragon, and it subtly establishes Merry as the more responsible of the two. Sam's costume also sets him apart at a glance. Merry and Pippin's clothing fits well and it's well made, but Sam's wardrobe is comparatively sloppy. It's not overdone, but it's enough that it'll catch your eye and allow you to immediately categorize him as less well off than Merry and Pippin. Even the texture of the material of his clothing is telling, especially when compared to the fine brocades and weaves of the others. It tells a tale of handmade clothing from cheaply made material. Sam's look at the birthday party is one of my absolute favorites. Compared to the other characters in the scene, Sam looks almost painfully awkward with his shirt, buttoned all the way up to his chin. His coat is ill-fit and worn down at the elbows, and looks just about 15 years out of style compared to the other young hobbits. Just at a glance, he looks like someone who doesn't attend many parties, but was forced to scrub up and dress well for this event. Without ever saying it out loud, we can read into his class, his relationship with Hobbiton, and his relationship with his friends. This becomes particularly obvious when we see Sam next to Frodo. Frodo's garb certainly isn't ostentatious, but it speaks of a quiet, secure kind of wealth. In the opening scene, his shirt and trousers are simple, but well fit and well maintained. The cool colors of his outfit immediately set him apart, as these aren't the typical Hobbit colors. At the birthday party, he is in a fine shirt with a fine detailed collar, similar in style to what Bilbo's wearing. His vest still hangs open though, firmly placing him into the category of youthful and carefree. Frodo is indeed significantly wealthier than many of his friends, but he doesn't feel any need to flaunt it. Dixon thought of him as a young gentleman, and this reads perfectly in fine materials and effortless good looks. We see him in a similar state for the rest of his time in the Shire. But when he leaves to take the ring from Hobbiton, there's an immediate visual difference. His vest is buttoned up for the first time, and this speaks of a much larger change. Frodo can no longer afford to be as carefree as he once was, and he begins to close himself off as he shoulders the mantle of responsibility that comes with bearing a ring of power. For the first leg of the journey, the other hobbits haven't really begun to change. As always, though, the story is in the details, particularly in their outerwear. Sam's coat looks to be made of rough wool, and it's collarless with elbow patches. It's a gardener's garment, simple in construction for a simple man. In comparison, Merry wears an embroidered vest with a neat coat, the clothes of a young gentleman ready to go commit some petty crimes with a pal. Pippin doesn't wear a vest, but a nice coat that looks a bit slouchy in the collar, as if it's poorly maintained. He also wears a hand-knit scarf, which makes me think that his frustrated mother threw it to him as he dashed out the door that morning. Frodo's clothing is all fine velvet, which would be terrible for a hike, but still does set him apart as the most well-dressed hobbit of the group. This difference is once again made absolutely clear by the different ways that their cloaks close. Sam's is a simple tie, easy, functional, cheap. Pippin's is a cloak pin, which would cost a bit more, but it's easy and requiring little extra effort. Merry's closes with a neat little button closure, and Frodo's is the most complex, crossing over itself. These super small details all mesh together to form these very strong visual signals. One of my favorite moments considering all these details is when the Fellowship receives the gifts of Galadriel, including their elven cloaks. All of the sudden, these little class differences are wiped clean, and their clothes don't matter. Uniforms are an excellent way to smooth out the differences in a group and bring them closer together. Tolkien would have been highly aware of this as a student in the 20th century as well as a soldier. Their new uniform becomes acutely important when the Fellowship splits apart shortly after receiving these gifts. Despite all of the miles between them, they still wear the same cloak, the same pin. They remain united as a fellowship, no matter what may come. As the trilogy progresses, the costumes begin to feel more and more lived in as elbows wear out and knees become ragged. We see the characters shifting before our very eyes, the internal state reflected by their costumes. Pippin declares fealty to Denethor and receives his Gondorian armor, while Merry joins the armies of Rohan, likewise taking up a new look. At the Battle of the Black Gate, Merry and Pippin can each be seen wearing their new sets of armor, but even then, they wear the elven cloaks atop. As Merry and Pippin slowly become more than who they were in the Shire, we see this reflected in the ways that their layers of costumes build up. They return home nearly unrecognizable, having grown up to be so much more than the town's troublemakers. Comparatively, Frodo and Sam's wardrobe moves in the opposite direction. They lose layers as their Shire clothes becomes progressively more worn. Their journey strips away everything except for their souls, leaving them little more than naked as they ascend Mount Doom. There are no uniforms, no luggage, no armor, no class divides, none of society's barriers. In the end, it's just the hearts of two hobbits that save Middle-earth. Though the hobbits do finally get some new clothes by the end of the trilogy, some things remain unchanged. Merry wears the vest that he's had since Fellowship, and Frodo is wearing a brown vest, very similar to the one he started out with. Sam's clothing fits awkwardly, and Pippin's vest looks a little bit too short. They may have changed and grown in many ways, but they are still themselves. By the time they return to the Shire, they are unchanged and utterly different. They wouldn't, at a glance, stick out from the other hobbits, but we still see pieces of their journey lingering in their wardrobe, as if the dregs of their struggle will never really fade. It's delicately done and incredibly subtle through small details like Pippin's hand-knit scarf reappearing in the scene at the Grey Havens, or the continued use of Frodo's very un-Hobbit-like color palette. This is essential to showing the audience that though the journey has ended, it has left them changed forever. Now, most of this discussion thus far has been based off of the visual differences in characters. However, in the Hobbit trilogy, there was no such luxury. From the moment that he first appears on screen, Bilbo epitomizes the Hobbit, with the capital T and H. Being the only Hobbit in the movie, the designers needed to get the point of his character across as simply and easily as possible. Thus, we see Bilbo dressed consistently in traditional Hobbit colors, especially his yellow waistcoat. At the unexpected party, Bilbo is in stark contrast to the dwarves. They're geared up for the road in armor, fur, and boots, and Bilbo looks like he's ready to turn in for bed. The designers immediately established a difference between the dwarves and Bilbo, setting them at odds. But just as we've seen with our other heroes, Bilbo changes throughout the journey. We see the slow breakdown of his costume as his more Hobbit-like traits are worn away by the road and by the dwarves. Seams fray, buttons are lost, and Bilbo leaves behind who he once was. One of the most important costuming moments in the Hobbit trilogy takes place in the Desolation of Smaug, when we see Bilbo getting a new item of clothing at last. A blue coat from Lake Town. It's oversized and more than a bit frumpy, but it matches what the rest of the company has been given to wear. The designers allowed Bilbo to step across that line in the sand and become part of the group at last. This is an important moment in the movie, as Bilbo's relationship with the company, and with Thorin in particular, will be very heavily strained in the story to come. By giving Bilbo a visual reminder of his unification with the group, his subsequent near rejection from the group stings all the more. However, he hangs on to his uniform throughout the Battle of Five Armies and does eventually mend his relationship with the company. We've seen Bilbo leave behind who he was, and the coat is representative of who he has chosen to become. Bilbo has almost completely transformed by the time he's journeying home. He's decked out not only in the blue coat, but in full dwarven garb, and it may be oversized, but he wears it with pride. Of course, by the time we see him in Lord of the Rings, he isn't still in full dwarven getup. Over the years, he's come back around to being comfortable and familiar in the life of a hobbit. But the pieces he brought back are still there, scattered around Bag End. Bilbo sheds off a great deal of the quest, but it never truly leaves his mind. This is most obvious as he prepares to leave Middle-earth at the end of the Return of the King, quite ready for another adventure. Now, at this point, you're probably feeling like you're sitting in English class while the teacher blathers on about why it was really important that the sky was blue in that one scene of the book that you didn't actually read. And I may be reading into things, but I also might not be. Picking apart brilliant work is how more brilliant work is made. And the costumes in The Lord of the Rings are a masterclass on the importance of attention to detail. 95% of people won't actually notice the different closures in the Hobbit costumes, but they will notice them in some way, even if it's just thinking that Frodo looks kinda pretentious. These details are what makes Lord of the Rings so special. And as more and more Tolkien-based film and television adaptations that seem to be desperately chasing after the notoriety and fame of these movies, creators could take a hint from the work of the design teams that have already poured hours of thought into this. Generic fantasy costumes don't win Oscars and make history. What makes the difference is love for the source material, and the teams behind the Lord of the Rings movies were undoubtedly in love with Tolkien's vision. In the Hobbit costumes, we see artists embracing the source material and allowing their art to tell the story. Thanks so much for joining me this week. I hope you enjoyed the discussion, and I would love to hear what you think. What other interpretations do you have, and what details did I miss? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, because it really helps me out, and hit subscribe if you would like to see more. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you all have a very happy Hobbity day.